We're beginning a study on the life of Abraham, which is actually a study in faith. Abraham is the first man that God taught this principle of living by faith. Now, there were others that had done acts of faith prior to Abraham, but Abraham, that became the whole theme of his life. And so that's why I call this study Living by Faith, Walking by Faith. It was a lifestyle that Abraham had to learn, and he's the one that discovered the only way to have a righteous life with God, to be right with God, was by faith. It's the only way it can be done. Abraham is the one that discovered that principle. And so I'd like for you to look in your notes at the first lesson on Father of the Faithful, and the text that we're taking here is from Genesis, the 12th chapter and verse 1. Genesis 12 and 1. And he says, "Now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you." This begins my first point that I see in Abram's life, and many times we fail to recognize these things, but he was just as human as you and I. And so the first thing I want to talk about is his disobedience. His disobedience. He failed to do what God told him to do. God calls Abram to come follow him when he lived in the Ur of the Chaldeans. That was back in what today modern day time would be called Iraq. Not too far from the place we call Baghdad today. This is where he was, Ur of the Chaldees. And the call of God came to him there. This verse in Genesis 12 and 1 is a renewed call. It said, the Lord had said to Abram. In other words, this is the second time God's called. This is not the first time. God called him when he was in Ur of the Chaldees. Now God is renewing that call. That ought to be encouraging to every one of us, because even if we miss it, even if we fail, even if we're disobedient, God still cares and loves us. Abram lived among idolaters, and he recognized the folly of idolatry, that idolatry was not going to meet the spiritual needs of his life while he was living in Ur of the Chaldees. And in the book of Joshua, the 24th chapter, Joshua talks about that. He lived among idolaters. This is when God called him. And God clearly said to him, leave your father's house. But he didn't do it. No, instead, he took his father with him. Or maybe we should say, he told his father about this visitation from God, and his father took control of this pilgrimage. He's the one that comes in charge. And you find that instead of Abram following God, he's following his daddy. And they start their journey. There's a map in your syllabus that you'll note where that Abram starts on the journey, and he goes up the Euphrates River. If he had went directly to the west, it was all desert area to the west. Instead of that, he followed the Euphrates River, and they went north until they get to this place, which was called Haran. Basically, what has happened is Terah, Abram's father, has taken charge of the journey. Now, I caution you about that because there are many of you that God is going to speak a specific word to your life. He's going to speak to you very clearly about what he wants you to do. I know from experience. I've experienced this many different ways in my life. God called me to preach when I was just a boy. That was very, very real to me. I look back on it now and it seems strange because God dealt with me with dreams. The old men shall dream dreams, but here I'm a boy having dreams. And yet in my dream, I was always a man. Now, that seems strange to me now. When I was a child, it didn't. But in my dreams, and it was a reoccurring dream, it happened over and over and over again, between the ages of 6 years until 8 years. And I was always preaching in those dreams. It was always different settings, sometimes in the church, sometimes outdoors, sometimes people that looked like me, sometimes people that looked very different than I did. But I was always a man, and I was always preaching in those dreams. Now, nobody else in my family had those dreams. Nobody else heard it. Nobody else knew, but it was very real to me. And I had to make the choice. Am I going to follow God? Or am I only going to follow the tradition of my fathers? Am I only going to do what my brothers and sisters do? I chose to follow God, and I'm very thankful for that. Abram failed, though. See, the truth is, partial obedience is still disobedience. Oh, yes, he left Ur of the Chaldees. Yes, he starts on this journey, but he took his daddy with him, and he also took his brother's son. His brother, Haran, was already dead. And so they take Lot with them. Lot was the son of Haran. It would be Abram's nephew. He takes them along. He cannot separate himself from his family. Now, I'm not saying that you should do that, but I'm saying Abram should have done that. If he had done that, the story would be different, and actually the story would be easier. But the good news is, even though he failed, God was still there. God still cared. The second thing I want to talk about is what I will call Abram's delay. When they get to this place that obviously his father named Haran. Why did he name it Haran? It's like an honor. It's a memorial to his dead son, Haran, that died when they lived in Ur of the Chaldees. And so he's honoring him. When they get to this point, that's as far as Terah is going. He stops. Abram stops with his father. And they stay there. The Bible tells us they were there until Terah died. Terah's name literally means to delay, to delay. And that's exactly what Abram does. They get to this place, which he called Haran, and they stop and stay there until his father is dead. Haran was a dry place. It's at the headwaters of the Euphrates River. That's where the river starts up in the north. But it was a dry place. The point is, when we fail to obey God, we're wasting opportunities. You're very young, but time is one of the most precious gifts you have. Time. Be careful with it. Why? Because you must spend it. But once you spend it, it's gone. So use your time wisely. What Abram had failed to do was to leave his father's house, leave his father, and start this journey of faith. And now because of that, he's stuck in Haran until his father died. His father dies at Haran. And that's when God speaks to Abram again. The good news is, God is a God of second chances, or third chances, or fourth. We don't know how many chances God gives us, but he continues to deal with us. See, God accepts you for who you are, but he will not leave you the way you are. If you follow God, God will change your life. And that's what's going to happen for Abraham. So it's the third thing that I want to talk about. Let me talk about his development, or his name has not become Abraham yet. He's just Abram. His development, the development of his faith. After his father Terah has died, God renews the call to him. And that's what I read to you in Genesis 12:1. The Lord had said to Abram. God is renewing the call. I'm so glad he does that. It's what we call faithfulness. God is faithful even when we fail to obey, when we're disobedient. God is faithful. Or as the Apostle Paul said, God cannot deny himself. And so God renews the call to Abram. God is faithful, as I said, even when we are unfaithful. Now, God makes no explanations to Abram about what he's doing. I want to emphasize this because this is the way you have to learn to live by faith. When you're living by faith, you will discover that God will give us a command and God will give us a promise. But God never makes explanations. He never explains to us why he's doing what he's doing. That's why we call it living by faith. See, living by faith means you don't have it all figured out. Living by faith, it's the opposite of living by your head, by your wits. That's what the world does. The world lives their life based on what they can figure out, what they're going to do. That's not a life of faith. And Abram has to learn this principle of trusting God. So God gives us a command, then God gives us a promise, and that's what he does for him. Come follow me to a land I will show you. In other words, you've never been here before. You don't know what this is going to be like. And I will make of you a great nation. A command and a promise, but no explanations. God doesn't do that. God never explains himself. We have to learn the principle of living by faith. Now, if there's any area of my life that I think I'm qualified to talk about, it's this area. Because now for 60 years, basically, that's been the lifestyle I have chose to live. A lifestyle of living by faith. In other words, I don't know where the money's coming from. I don't know where I will be, next year. I just came from being with some refugees in a certain country that I won't name on video, but I was there among them. A year ago, I never dreamed that I would be there and be doing that kind of thing. You don't know where God will lead you if you're going to follow him. But God does not explain, okay, this is what's going to happen. Here's where the money is coming from. No. That's not faith. There's always a risk that is involved in living by faith. That comes with God not giving us explanations. The world lives by what I will call scheming. And I take this from Genesis, the 17th chapter and verse 1. That's where God changes Abram's name to Abraham. And he says, walk before me and be upright. That word upright comes from a Hebrew word that literally means without scheming. Oh, so many people live by their wits. I see this even among preachers, that so many preachers are trying to figure it all out up here. You're never going to figure God completely out. It's a life of faith. One of the problems that I see that we're facing in our world today is so many people only want to believe what they can prove in a test tube. I just had a young man approach me a few days ago, and he was talking about, do you believe in Adam and Eve? I said, I certainly do. But you can't prove that they ever existed. I said, true. But you can't prove that they did not. I have more proof than you have. You're standing in front of me. Where did you come from? And so, in other words, he wants to say what I believe is only scientific proof. No, nonsense. It's a belief system just like I have a belief system. I can't put God in a test tube and prove that he is God. It's impossible. That's why we call it living by faith. But the atheist lives by faith also, a non-theistic faith. He doesn't believe in God, but it's still a worldview of what he believes. Living by faith is living without scheming. If you're going to try to limit your life to just what's between your two ears, you're living in a very small world. Because there are so many things we don't understand. I mentioned in my message how that I don't understand how brown cows can drink clear water and eat green grass that makes white milk and turns to yellow butter. I don't understand, but I'm not stopping drinking the milk and eating the butter. We live by faith. There's a multitude of things that we do not understand. So I challenge you, learn what Abraham had to learn, the lesson of living by faith. Now, there's three things I want to emphasize here concerning Abram's journey of faith, what he has to learn. First of all, he does not know where God was leading him. And you don't either if you're following him by faith. I've been married now for right at 48 years. We'll be celebrating 48 years in June this year. And that's one of the things I honor and respect about my wife so much is she believed me when I had nothing but a dream. Nothing. I didn't have any money. I didn't have any proof. I just had a dream. I'm going to preach the gospel around the world. She believed me, and I have done it. I have done it. I have almost 4 million miles with American Airlines alone. That's not talking about another 60 airlines I've flown around on the world. Millions of miles. I don't know if you know how far 1 million miles is, but 1 million miles is like circling planet Earth 40 times. I've done that again and again and again. Where did the money come from? I don't know. Only God knows. God provides it. God is my source. I'm simply doing what He told me to do. Now, does it get easier? Some ways it gets easier in that it's easier for me to believe for $500 now. The first year I traveled as an evangelist, my whole offerings for the total year was $550. I mean, it's easier to believe for but now I've got to believe for 50,000 or, you know, in other words, God always keeps upping the ante, and so the faith step becomes bigger. Do you understand? You don't know where God's going to lead you. There's no way. I knew in my heart, my dream was I'm going to travel the world and preach the gospel. I didn't have a clue how I was going to do it. I just believed God put that in my heart. That's what I'm going to do. And so the last 2 weeks, I was in the Mideast. I was in Romania. I will be in 2 weeks in Guatemala. I mean, it just goes on and on and on like that. It's living by faith. You don't know where God's going to lead you. You don't know where a life of faith will take you. But I assure you one thing, it will never be boring. Never. The second thing that I see is he not only didn't know where God was leading, he doesn't know how God is going to do this. Now, we're going to see this in detail in his life because, he's married, but the problem is both he and his wife are getting older and they don't have any children. They never have had any children. And so it's going to become a big test of their faith is how God is going to do it. And the temptation is to help God do it, to help God fulfill the promise. So he doesn't know where God's leading him. He doesn't know how God is going to do it. And you don't either. I don't either. That's the risk that is involved in living a life of faith. And the third thing I see concerning the development of his faith is he doesn't know why God is testing him. And I assure you, the test get bigger in life. They always get bigger. I'll show you that in Abram's life in just a moment. But as you learn to live a life of faith, you don't know where, you don't know how, you don't know why. You can't live a life of faith by living by your wits, living by reasoning. You've got to learn to live by your spirit. Faith is natural of the Spirit. It is a fruit of the Spirit. It is a gift of the Spirit. It comes out of our spirit relationship with God. And this is what Abram is going to discover. I cannot do this by myself. There's a theme that you find in Abram's life that followed him consistently to the end of his life. It's what I would call separation. Separation. It was the theme of his life, that God continually called him away from something. As we saw in the first call is, get thee out of thy father's house and from your kindred and from this land to a land that you don't know. This separation, that's what makes it difficult for us to follow God by faith. To follow him by faith always requires something. Now, listen to me very carefully here, because I want to emphasize this. It cost me nothing to become a Christian. Nothing. Well, I hear people talk about, I had to give up smoking. Yeah, I mean, you're complaining about cancer sticks? I mean, what's the big deal? No, I gave up nothing that was worth talking about. The only things I gave up were things that were killing me, destroying me. That's the only things. No, Jesus paid that price. What did I give up? To become a man of God, it has cost me everything. Everything. As a young preacher, I would have never thought at this stage of my life, I seldom sleep on the same pillow twice. It's just continual. Why? Living by faith, following the dream. This is what Abram has to learn. Separation. For instance, the very word Hebrew, he's the first one that's called the Hebrew. The word Hebrew simply means one who has crossed over. And what he's talking about here is crossing over the Euphrates River and beginning this journey with God, beginning this faith walk, walking with God. That's what he's talking about. The one that crossed over. And so that's what God's calling you and I. If we're going to follow him, there's only one way we can do it. By faith. By faith. It's the only way that it can be accomplished. Let me show you. I mentioned that the test gets bigger. Look in Abram's life. The first thing God said, leave your kindred. Leave your family behind. Secondly, leave your homeland. Whatever he had in Ur of the Chaldees. I don't know if he had a house, probably did. Property, leave it all behind. Leave the homeland behind. The third thing he said to him is, leave Egypt behind. We'll see that in an upcoming lesson, that he goes to Egypt. Not in the will of God. He went there to get away from his troubles. And God says to him, you've got to leave Egypt behind. It's a picture, of course, of the world. The fourth one is, leave your nephew Lot. Now, that was a part of his family that he really struggled with letting Lot go. Lot went with him all the way to the promised land. But it only become problems for Abram. Instead of it being, a blessing to him, I'm so glad to have my nephew. No, his nephew became a problem for him. He had to let him go. Not only that, Ishmael. Oh, now God's getting closer, because Ishmael was his son, not by his wife Sarah, by another woman. But he's still his son. And you've got to let your Ishmaels go. And then finally, not only Ishmael, but the last one is Isaac. Isaac was the promised seed, the promised son that God had promised to him and Sarah all the way back in Ur of the Chaldees. If you'll come follow me, I'm going to make of you a great nation. And your family is going to become exceeding great. God had promised it. And that's what I have discovered in following God. God not only asks us to give up things that are a problem to us, there comes a test where God asks us to give up the promises. Do you love him, or do you love what he gave you? It's a test. It was a test in Abram's life. See, a life of faith requires that. A life of faith requires us to give back to God everything he has given to us. Only when we do that are we going to fulfill the things that God wants to accomplish in our life. Only are we going to reach our destiny when we're willing to give it up. Do you really trust him or not? Do you really believe or not? See, the lesson of living whys. I'm not saying it's sinful to ask the question why. Even Jesus did that on the cross. Why have you forsaken me? But that's where faith becomes involved. Are you going to trust God even when you don't understand? Are you going to believe when everything seems to be crazy? Why is this happening? There's so many things in life we don't know the answer. Why? We have to learn to believe, to put our faith in God. That's what God is going to teach Abram in these lessons. A lifestyle of faith. Now, as I mentioned in my life, that's what I've lived by for these many, many years now. And I cannot tell you how many millions of dollars have crossed through my hands. I can guesstimate how many millions of miles I have traveled. I didn't do that of myself. I only did that by following Jesus, following the call of God. And the result, I wouldn't trade it for anything. See, I know a lot of older preachers. They'll use words like mature because they don't like to say old or elderly. And so many of my friends, they're old. And what I see for many of them, they're just old, tired preachers. I don't want to end like that. I don't want to end just an old, tired preacher. No. One of my friends told the story about an old preacher that had influenced his life as a young minister, and he heard the old gentleman was dying, and he went to see him, and he said, he's lying there in the bed, and he's saying to him, said, God has used you to bless me so much. Can you tell me, what is the greatest spiritual experience you've ever had? And the old gentleman looked back to it and smiled at him and said, it hasn't happened yet, son. Boy, I love that kind of spirit. I love that kind of attitude. The last days ought to be the greatest days. It can only be that way if we are living by faith. If we're living by faith. But the moment that we switch over and we start trying to live by what we know, what we've experienced, what we've learned, then we start dying. When you stop learning, you start dying. I never want to graduate. I just want to graduate to another level of influence, another experience with God. And that's what God is going to be teaching Abram in these lessons. So that's what living by faith is all about. Living a life of faith means leaving an unbelieving world behind, even when that unbelieving world can include your family, or in Abram's case, even his father. He had to leave it behind. His nephew, you have to leave behind anything that is keeping you from following God on a journey of faith. And that's what we discover this whole study about Abram is about. learning how to follow God by faith. And because he did it, God used him to change our world today. Though he lived thousands of years ago, we're still talking about Abraham today. Why? Because he learned how to live by faith. Thank you very much.